The gym was quiet in that particular way only real training spaces ever are. Not silent, but hushed. Like the walls themselves understood that something serious was happening inside them. And the air smelled of canvas mats, old leather, and sweat that had soaked into the floor over years of honest work, not staged performances. And Bruce was already there when Chuck arrived, barefoot as always, moving slowly through his warm-up, not rushing, not showing off, just rolling his spine, loosening his hips, breathing like time wasn't chasing him, while Chuck came in with that unmistakable presence of a man who'd earned his reputation the hard way. Shoulders broad, posture upright, confidence worn like a tailored jacket. And if you'd been watching from the outside, with no context, you would have assumed Chuck was the dominant figure in the room. Bigger, heavier, visibly stronger, the kind of man who looked like violence had been shaped around him. And Bruce looked almost relaxed by comparison, lighter, quieter, almost casual. And that contrast is important because it set the stage for everything that followed. They'd agreed to spar lightly, nothing official, nothing for cameras, just movement, exploration, respect between two men who had both tested themselves against the limits of their disciplines. And at first, the mood was friendly, familiar. The way it gets when two professionals trust each other enough to remove the armor of ego. And they stretched, exchanged a few words, laughed even, because confidence doesn't always need tension to exist. And then Chuck, still smiling, made the comment that would hang in the air far longer than he expected. "I'll go easy on you," he said, not cruelly, not mockingly, just casually, like a man adjusting his grip before a handshake. And a few people nearby chuckled because it sounded harmless, the kind of thing fighters say without thinking. But Bruce didn't laugh. He didn't bristle either. He just looked at Chuck for a brief second, eyes steady, and nodded once. As if he'd just been handed a piece of information he intended to test. They squared up with no ceremony, no bell, no countdown, just two men stepping into range, and from the first second, the difference in energy was noticeable. Chuck moved with that structured power of someone trained to dominate space. One people died in slaves, and every step grounded, every shift deliberate, while Bruce seemed almost fluid, like he wasn't occupying space so much as borrowing it temporarily. And for the first couple of exchanges, Bruce didn't do much at all. He slipped, angled, circled, let Chuck advance. And to an outside observer, it might have looked like Bruce was being cautious, maybe even deferential, reinforcing Chuck's assumption that he was controlling the pace. And that assumption is where the lesson began. Which Chuck have you recapped? Chuck threw a probing strike, measured, controlled, just enough to test reactions. And Bruce wasn't there, not in a dramatic way, not with a big retreat, but with a subtle shift that left the strike finishing in emptiness. And before Chuck could fully reset, Bruce's hand touched his forearm, not striking, just making contact, and then vanished again. And Chuck smiled wider because touches don't feel threatening when you believe they're harmless. And he pressed forward with a combination. Nothing reckless, sharp, clean. The kind of movement that had broken plenty of opponents down over the years. And Bruce flowed around it, not running, not blocking, just never occupying the same line twice. And the strange thing was how little effort it seemed to take. Like Bruce was always arriving where Chuck had already been. By the fourth second, Chuck's smile had faded slightly. Not into concern, but curiosity. The kind of curiosity that says, okay, this is interesting. And he increased the pressure, stepping in harder, tightening his angles. And he increased the pressure, stepping in harder, tightening his angles. And that's when Bruce changed gears without changing expression. Because up until that moment, he'd been observing, reading timing, rhythm, breath, but now he acted. And it happened so fast that later, when people tried to describe it, nobody could agree on the exact sequence, only on the result. Bruce stepped inside Chuck's reach as Chuck committed to another strike, not retreating like most men would against a larger opponent, but closing the distance where strength becomes awkward. And in that instant, Bruce's hand connected, not with force, but with precision, a sharp, compact movement aimed at structure rather than pain. And Chuck felt it immediately, not as impact, but as interruption, like a sentence cut off mid-word. And before his body could interpret what had happened, Bruce was already elsewhere, repositioned, balanced, ready, and Chuck froze. Not because he was hurt, but because his system needed a moment to recalibrate. 6 seconds in, Chuck stood there blinking, breath caught, halfway between inhale and exhale, mind racing to catch up with a body that had just been outmaneuvered in a way he wasn't accustomed to. And the room went still, not because anyone had told it to, but because everyone felt the shift. And Bruce lowered his hands and waited, calm as if nothing noteworthy had occurred. While Chuck slowly straightened, eyes focused now in a way they hadn't been before. Not amused, not dismissive, but alert. And someone nearby later described that moment perfectly, saying it looked like Chuck had just realized he'd been speaking a language he didn't fully understand. Chuck cleared his throat, opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, because there was nothing obvious to say. No joke that fit, no explanation. That preserved the original confidence of that comment. And Bruce didn't rush to fill the silence, because silence, in his world, was often the most accurate teacher. And after a few seconds, that felt much longer than they were, Chuck nodded slowly, once, acknowledging something internal, and said quietly, "Okay." And that one word carried more respect than the earlier quip ever had. They resumed, but the energy was completely different now. Not adversarial, not condescending, but exploratory in a deeper way. And Chuck no longer went easy. He went attentive, focused, fully present. And Bruce met him there. And what followed wasn't domination or humiliation. but something far more revealing, a dialogue of movement, where every exchange stripped away assumptions and replaced them with understanding. And Chuck tested Bruce in ways he hadn't before, changing rhythm, adjusting tactics, trying to find the seams in that fluid defense. And Bruce responded not with brute answers, but with timing, angles, economy, showing again and again that efficiency wasn't a lack of power, it was refined power. At one point, Chuck paused mid-exchange and actually laughed, not out of mockery or dismissal, but out of genuine disbelief. The kind of laugh that escapes when your worldview cracks just enough to let new light in. And he shook his head slightly, eyes locked on Bruce, and said, "You're fast." And Bruce tilted his head, thoughtful. "Speed is a result." He replied calmly, "Not the goal." And Chuck absorbed that in silence, because he could feel the truth of it in his own body. What struck everyone watching wasn't that Bruce had momentarily neutralized a larger, stronger man. It was how little drama there was in it. No flair, no aggression, no need to assert dominance. Just quiet competence revealing itself when tested. And Chuck, to his credit, didn't react with resentment. He reacted with curiosity, asking questions between rounds, testing ideas, treating the experience not as a threat to his identity, but as an expansion of it. And that willingness is the only reason the story ends in respect rather than rivalry. When they finally stopped, both breathing hard now, sweat darkening the mat beneath them, Chuck stood there for a long moment, hands on hips, staring at the floor, as if replaying the opening seconds again and again. Searching for the exact moment his assumption had failed him. And then he looked up at Bruce and said, "Sincerely, I didn't expect that." And Bruce smiled softly, not triumphantly, just warmly. "Expectations are heavy," he said. "They slow you down." And Chuck nodded, understanding that this wasn't a comment about fighting alone. Later, when people asked Chuck about that sparring session, he didn't boast. He didn't deflect. He simply said it taught him something important, that real mastery doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when challenged. End of chapter 2. And that going easy is a luxury you only have when you truly understand what's in front of you. And Bruce, when asked, dismissed the whole thing with a shrug, saying only that sparring is conversation, not conquest, and that the goal is to learn, not to win. But everyone who witnessed those 6 seconds knew the truth. In that brief exchange, a casual remark had collided with a deeper reality, and the result wasn't injury or embarrassment. It was silence, the kind of silence that follows genuine understanding. When words suddenly feel unnecessary because something far more important has already been said through action. And so what it says. After that moment, the sparring didn't end the way most people imagine these stories end, with someone walking away broken or defeated, because that's not how real respect is forged. It's not carved out of humiliation. It's not confining. It's shaped through understanding. And Chuck understood now that whatever he thought he knew about control, Bruce was operating several layers deeper, not louder, not stronger in the obvious sense, but cleaner, sharper, more economical, like a blade that doesn't swing wide because it doesn't need to, and the two of them kept moving, slower now, deliberately, as if they were both aware that the first 6 seconds had already answered the question that didn't need to be asked out loud. Chuck adjusted his stance, lowered his center of gravity, widened his awareness, and Bruce noticed immediately, because Bruce always noticed. And instead of exploiting that adjustment, he mirrored it, not to match Chuck, but to remove the advantage of familiarity, forcing both of them into neutral territory. And what followed looked less like a fight and more like a study. Each exchange peeling back another assumption. Each pause carrying more meaning than a flurry of strikes ever could, and the room stayed quiet because nobody wanted to break the rhythm that had taken over. Not with chatter, not with commentary, not with ego. At one point, Chuck stepped back and exhaled slowly, palms open, a subtle signal that he wanted to stop for a moment, and Bruce immediately lowered his guard, because control also means knowing when to disengage, and disengage, knowing when to disengage. And Chuck looked at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief that hadn't been there earlier, and he said, "That didn't feel like sparring." And Bruce nodded slightly. "Because you weren't trying to win anymore," he replied, and that landed heavier than any strike, because Chuck realized that the shift hadn't been forced on him. It had happened naturally the moment his assumptions collapsed. They sat on the edge of the mat for a while after that, sweat cooling, breath steadying, and Chuck stared at his hands like he was seeing them differently. Not weaker, just less central than he'd always believed. And he asked a question that only someone genuinely open would ask. "When did you know?" And Bruce didn't rush the answer, because good answers need space. "When you spoke," he said, finally. And Chuck looked up, confused. "When I said I go easy," and Bruce nodded, "Yes." And Chuck frowned, not defensive now, just curious. "Why?" And Bruce explained in that quiet, almost conversational way that made his philosophy feel practical instead of mystical. Because when someone says that, he said, they're already thinking in terms of superiority, and superiority makes you blind, and Chuck absorbed that slowly, because it wasn't an insult, it was an observation. Bruce continued, "If you go easy, you decide the outcome before the exchange begins." And he tapped the mat lightly with his fingers. "But the moment you decide, you stop learning." And Chuck let out a slow breath, nodding again. If you tell Fizzlebus, Doc sighed, because it echoed something he'd felt in those 6 seconds but hadn't yet been able to articulate. That strange feeling of control, slipping away, not because he was weaker, but because he was late. It had to do with perception. Word of that sparring session spread quietly. the way real stories always do. Not through headlines or bravado, but through changed behavior. Through the way Chuck trained afterward, more attentive, more experimental, less interested in proving and more interested in understanding. And people noticed that shift long before they heard the story, because growth leaves traces in how a man moves, how he listens, how he speaks. And when someone finally asked Chuck directly what had happened that day, he didn't dramatize it. He didn't inflate it. He simply said, "I learned something fast," and left it at that, because anything more would have cheapened the lesson. Bruce, on the other hand, never mentioned it at all. Not because it wasn't significant, but because to him it wasn't exceptional. It was expected. The natural outcome of two men testing ideas instead of egos. And that's what most people miss about stories like this. They focus on the quip, the 6 seconds, the silence. But the real weight of the moment lived in what followed, and how one man's casual confidence transformed into quiet respect, and how the other man never needed to claim superiority to reveal it. Years later, people would still argue about who would win, who was stronger, who was faster, who was more dangerous. Because people love outcomes, they love scorecards, they love clean answers to messy realities. But those arguments always miss the point, because that sparring session wasn't about victory. It was about exposure, the exposure of a deeper truth, that mastery doesn't announce itself with words. It doesn't need permission. It simply waits. Patient and precise, for the moment when assumption steps forward unguarded. And if you listen carefully to the way Chuck spoke about Bruce in later years, not with rivalry, not with jealousy, but with reverence, you can hear the echo of those 6 seconds in his tone, the respect of a man who understands that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous one is often the quietest, the one that doesn't need to say, "I'll go easy," because it doesn't think in those terms at all. That day in that quiet gym didn't produce a knockout, didn't produce bruises or headlines, but it produced something far rarer, a recalibration. The kind that stays with you long after your body forgets the feel of the mat. And whenever someone tells the story now, they tend to embellish it, to add drama, to stretch the moment into something cinematic. But the truth is simpler and more powerful than any exaggeration. One man spoke casually, another man responded honestly, and in the space of 6 seconds, a lesson was delivered without cruelty, without anger, without noise. Because real skill doesn't shout. It doesn't warn. It just shows up when tested, and lets silence do the talking.